All right, thank you very much. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be talking about watershed management, but this morning we were talking a lot about algae, about aquatic vegetation, and when we focus on lake management, very frequently we spend a lot of time on the symptoms of the problem. And the symptoms are the algae blooms, high densities of aquatic vegetation, maybe a suboptimal fishery, some shoreline or stream bank erosion, but those are the symptoms. The causes very frequently are watershed-based. They are septic, waste, they can be stormwater runoff, agricultural runoff, fertilizers, erosion associated with stream banks and shorelines. And for a lake community, this is a very captive audience, but very frequently I have to give talks to a variety of stakeholders. So very frequently, if someone's not living in a lake community, they may say, well, what do I care if a stream bank is eroding? Why should I worry about stormwater management and watershed protection? Well, it's because of situations like this. And so very frequently, a lot of the stuff that I talk about, even though a lake community is, well, I always say, a captive audience, they're very curious and very concerned about these circumstances. Watershed management, stormwater affects everyone. You know, it can affect you from your home, your transportation, getting to work or home, even your very safety. So just keep that in mind as I go through the presentation. I do, as was mentioned, I'm an adjunct professor at Del Val. I teach a class on watershed management, and I'm showing you the syllabus. What I'm going to try to do is take this 3-month course and cram it into 35 minutes. So don't tell my students I'm doing that, but obviously a lot of this I won't be covering, but there are some key points. So like I said, this is a very concise version of that watershed management class. So first of all, what is a watershed? A watershed is a specific area of land that drains into a given water body. And if you've driven in and out of the Chautauqua Lake watershed, you've seen the sign saying you're now entering the watershed. That's giving you an idea that once you pass that point, all the land in that area drains directly into that receiving waterway. And I like to use this as an example. If you think of like a tarp over a swimming pool, and if the water at the bottom is your lake, any rain you know that's going to hit that tarp is going to end up in that pool. That would be your watershed. More appropriate example is maybe the funnel. So if you think of your lake being at the bottom of the funnel, anything that hits that funnel will eventually go in to that water body. And that's essentially what a watershed is. It's all the land that drains directly into a given water body. So for the Chautauqua Lake watershed, and I have to say a lot of the data that I pulled for this presentation comes from the management plan, volume 2 of the management plan. It's a really great and comprehensive document. I really urge you to check that out online. But if you look at your watershed, it's approximately 100,000 acres, 300 miles of streams and creeks, 42 miles of shoreline. The lake itself is 13,000 acres, with the northern basin being about 1,000 acres larger, and it's deeper. It's on average depth of 26 feet, where the southern basin is shallower with an average depth of 11 feet. We talk about watershed management, and the professor who taught the class before I taught it was very into soils. He focused a lot on soils. I focus a lot on water, on the water cycle. And something to keep in mind with the water cycle is when rain's hitting your watershed, that rain is going to go one of 3 routes. It's either going to go into the ground through infiltration, it will go back up into the atmosphere either through evaporation or evapotranspiration through the plants, or it's going to move as surface runoff eventually into receiving streams, lakes, and eventually the ocean. So keep that in mind as I go through the talk. And this is just showing you another example of that hydraulic cycle. That rain falls, it will either go into the ground, back up into the atmosphere, or will eventually go into a receiving waterway. So for your hydrologic budget, and again, based on the management plan that is online, the vast majority of the rain that hits your watershed flows as surface runoff or base flow. Base flow is the flow in a stream when there's no rain event. I like to call the base flow, it's almost like an outcropping of groundwater. If you have flow in a stream and there's been no rain, that's coming associated with groundwater. So that surface runoff, stream flow, 78, that's part groundwater but mostly surface runoff. Precipitation accounts for 17%, and then your deeper groundwater aquifers count for the remaining 5%. So the vast majority of your water is running over the watershed. When you talk about the watershed, and I mentioned the 3 routes, the one we're very familiar with is evaporation. That's, heats up, the water molecules get agitated, and then the water turns into water vapor, goes up into the atmosphere. There's also evapotranspiration, and what that means is vegetation takes water up by its roots, and through the leaves, they have little cells called stomata that open up and will allow water to go up into the atmosphere. So when we say evapotranspiration, we're usually talking about vegetation, primarily trees, moving that water, pumping it from the ground up into the atmosphere. Now when you look at your land cover for your watershed, slightly more than 50% of it is forested. And that has a lot of benefits associated with it. I spend a lot of time in class talking about the value of vegetation, in particular trees, when it comes to stormwater management. Trees intercept a lot of the runoff. They help to get the water into the ground. They also, through evapotranspiration, put a lot of water back up into the atmosphere. So there's some interesting facts about trees when it comes to stormwater. One is a tree's canopy accounts for about 20% of the precipitation. So whenever there's a rain event, you have a lot of tree cover, 20% of that precipitation ends up on the leaves and will eventually, be utilized or will go back up into the atmosphere. A semi-mature tree has the capacity through evapotranspiration to remove 4,000 gallons of runoff. One tree. And then another study showed that a forest of approximately 10,000 trees can retain approximately 10 million gallons of stormwater. This is why trees are very important. They really help to remove a lot of runoff that would eventually just move into receiving waterways. So obviously trees of varying sizes and species really maximize this, what's called bioretainment. So it's this retaining of the stormwater. And these next 2 to 4 slides are really the crux of the presentation, that when you have a piece of land and say it's primarily forested, rainfall's coming down on an annual basis, 45 inches a year. Look at how much is going back up into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration, 25 inches. And if you look at base flow at 12 inches, you have water going into the ground through infiltration. Runoff is a small amount. It's only about 8 inches of all that rain coming down in a forested piece of land will move as surface runoff. As soon as you remove that vegetation and you put impervious surfaces on that piece of property, you're doing 2 things. Number one, you're removing the ability to put water into the ground or put water into the atmosphere. You're reducing that, number one. And number 2, now you have these impervious surfaces that you can't even just get water into the ground. So look at the runoff here. Now the runoff has spiked up quite a bit. So now instead of only 8 inches runoff here, of the 45 inches a year, now we have 42 inches. So we have a lot more stormwater. And in addition to that volume of stormwater, there's another thing that happens. So this is called a hydrograph. This is showing you the rain event, which are the green bars, and it's showing you the actual storm event, which is the light blue, showing you that peak. What happens is as development occurs, 2 things. One is that peak will get larger, like in this situation, and the time between the peak of the storm and the peak of the runoff narrows. So that means stormwater, you have more stormwater and it's moving quicker. So this is why, if you look at a pre-development, you have that nice slow green curve. As soon as you have development, if you don't have the proper best management practices installed, you have a peak, substantially higher amount of surface runoff, and it's happening a lot quicker. So if you look at something like a site here, and you think of all the impervious surfaces, the rooftop, the parking lot, the sidewalks, all of those impervious surfaces are now allowing that runoff to move, and it's moving faster. So it's picking up pollutants and it's carrying them along, going into streams. That increased volume is why we see flooding. So in a situation like this, what you would like are some sort of series of best management practices installed to try to minimize the volume of stormwater. Obviously, the easiest thing to do is to have as much vegetation remain on site. If you can't do that, then after that, the next stage is installing some stormwater BMPs. So here we show a bioretainment. We have the permeable pavers that allow stormwater to go into the ground. And we also have some bioretention, such as this. Do quite a bit of this, installation of rain gardens or biofiltration cells. So instead of that runoff from this parking lot going into the adjacent stream, it goes into this rain garden where the water can go infiltrate into the ground or go back up into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. Nutrients and pollutants are being retained. So the whole goal is to try to reduce that peak with a lot of stormwater management measures. In addition to increasing the volume and carrying pollutants along, there have been a lot of studies to show that this increased volume of runoff associated with impervious surfaces has a direct impact on the quality of the ecology of these systems. So this is showing the impacts associated with a stream that, you know, as little as an increase of 5% of impervious surfaces can shift you from a brook to a brown trout, and then something as low as even 10% or even a little higher, you can lose a trout habitat situation. And there are various reasons for that I won't get into, but this is just showing you there have been a lot of studies to demonstrate that as the increased imperviousness continues to rise, we see a decline in ecological value. And this is also explicitly seen in macroinvertebrates. We spent a lot of time in the class talking about the little bugs in the water and how they're good indicators of the quality of water. And we can see this when we associate it with impervious cover, that as those impervious surfaces increase, we go from the highly sensitive organisms like mayflies and stoneflies to the more pollutant-tolerant organisms, like the chironomids or the aquatic worms. So this, you know, this stormwater has an impact both on the ecology as well as flooding and carrying of pollutants. Do spend some time talking about soils, and soil particles are very important to get a handle on, that you have, you know, relatively speaking, gravel, sand, silt, clay. Clay is very microscopic. We all know what sand looks like, those sand particles. For stormwater management, we like to have a loam. You know, so for example, when I show you a rain garden, we like to have a soil structure that those plants are in that's a loam mix, which includes some silt, some clay, some sand. We want to mix, because if you have all sand, the water will just flow very rapidly and you don't have the ability to retain some of the pollutants. But if you have all clay, it will just sit there and it won't infiltrate. So loam is what we're usually looking for, a nice mix of clay to silt to sand, and that's usually the highest cost associated with a biofiltration system or a rain garden, is getting that right mix of soil. If you look at the soil triangle with the sands, the silts and the clays, again, the loam's in the middle. You want that nice mix. When you look at the soils in your watershed, 71% of them are described as a sandy clay loam. And again, this is taken from the management plan, which is they have a relatively low infiltration when wetted. So keep that in mind, low infiltration. That means the water is going to sit there or it's going to be conveyed. We also go through something that's called the K factor when it comes to soil erodibility. And K factor is a way of assessing how easily a soil erodes and how far it can be transported. So things that have low K values are like stuff high in clays, because clays are very resistant to being eroded. It's one of the reasons why for ponds we'll use bentonite, a clay, to line the bottom, is that it doesn't erode, it stays intact and the water can't get through it. Sands, though, also have a low K value, this erodibility factor, because even though sands are easily erodible, they're heavier, they're larger particles, so they aren't conveyed at a large distance. But things that have a lot of silt, like a silty loam, they have a moderate susceptibility because they can be detached and they can move a decent distance with some energy. If you have high silt content, that's where you have something that's highly erodible. And that K value, if it's greater than 0.4, that's where you're very susceptible to erosion. When you look at the K factors for your watershed, they're in the 3s, which, if we go back to here, means moderate amount of erosion. So again, keep that in mind. Moderate amount of erosion. That means anywhere there's exposed soil, whether it's an exposed piece of property or a stream bank or shoreline area, that land is moderately susceptible to erosion. That means there's a decent amount that can be broken apart and fall in and go into a receiving waterway. And a lot of your phosphorus is stuck onto those particles. So very frequently, all of that erosion is bringing phosphorus into those lakes. And then the aquatic plants can use that phosphorus. If it's down in the bottom, they pump it up. Algae can use it as the plants die. The algae also utilize it, so it's bringing phosphorus in that's stimulating plant growth. We also talk about wetlands, and the 3 components of wetlands that you need to have a wetland. You need to have the hydrology. So do you have an area that is inundated with water or has saturated soil? Are the soils considered hydric, and what type of vegetation? So I'm not going to go into it. We have a whole class or 2 on wetlands. I do want to emphasize that wetlands are very important in that they remove a lot of pollutants. They help to put water up into the atmosphere. In Chautauqua Lake watershed, about 3% of your land is wetlands, and that's about 3,000 acres of wetlands. And wetlands have a lot of value. Number one, they're a great refuge habitat for a variety of organisms. So there's a lot of desirable wildlife that utilizes wetlands at some point in their life cycle. But then if you look at evaporation and evapotranspiration in wetlands, it's about 50-50. So when you're in the upland areas, transpiration may be 80% of the water going up into the atmosphere. Obviously at a lake, it's all just evaporation. But in a wetland, it's about 50-50. Half of it's from evaporation, half of it's going through the plants up into the atmosphere. I'm not going to get into this, but I put this down to emphasize that wetlands are very important in that they help to retain and remove nutrients. They're very effective at removing pollutants. As a matter of fact, I'll show you some BMPs that use wetlands to treat runoff. But there's a very complex cycle involved with carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in the wetland ecosystems. So wetlands can be used to settle out particulates. They can be used to mitigate some storm flows, and they can, like I mentioned, assimilate pollutants, particularly nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. So this is just an example of a pocket wetland. Very frequently, we try to do large wetland BMPs, but in lake communities, pocket wetlands tend to be more feasible because in most lake communities you have very little land to install large conventional BMPs. So in the case of Lake Luxembourg down in Core Creek, we installed a 1/3 of an acre of pocket wetland. It was taking runoff from a hospital that wasn't being mitigated that would end up into a stream that would go into the lake. We installed this pocket wetland. We have a little settling basin there, so the water goes in, the heavier stuff settles out. So that forebay area is cleaned out once a year. Then once that storm event hits a certain size, the water is then diverted into those wetland cells. The water goes into the wetland, the additional settling occurs, but then the nutrients can be retained. So I'm talking about pollutants, and there are a variety of them. We tend to focus a lot on nitrogen and phosphorus because that's what's stimulating the algae and plant growth, but there are a variety of other pollutants to keep in mind. There's bacteria, there are heavy metals, all sorts of other pollutants, sediments. And then another part of the talk, I spend a lot of time on non-point source pollution and the variety of BMPs that can be implemented. And again, BMP stands for Best Management Practice. It's a way of mitigating or addressing the pollution. So we go through agricultural BMPs, urban, suburban, source control, septic management. We talk about internal loading in lakes. Again, looking at your watershed, if you look at the combination of agricultural and of residential, a little under half of your land is ag and residential. So all the pollutants associated with those types of land go into the receiving waterway. I'm intrigued by the vacant, the 37% vacant. When I hear vacant, I think, ooh, some property where you can install some large green infrastructure or stormwater management practices that could help mitigate against flooding or pollutant loading. So whenever I see vacant, that's what I think of. I think of, ooh, maybe that's some property that can be used for stormwater management. Agricultural runoff. Yeah, again, each type of land use will generate a slightly different type of pollutant. Agricultural runoff, a lot of sediments, a lot of nutrients, possibly some pesticides, but we go through a wide variety of BMPs, manure control, just making sure the livestock don't go into the stream can really do a lot. Grassed waterways, conservation tillage, there's all sorts of agricultural BMPs that can be implemented. And then in a suburban and urban setting, there's a variety of BMPs that can be implemented. Whenever I see a parking lot and I see one of those parking islands that bump up with mulch, it drives me nuts. Why don't they design it so it goes down, so it's collecting runoff into some type of rain garden or biofiltration system? So instead of putting mulch on and piling it up, have those little islands, work for their keep. Make sure that they're taking that runoff off that parking lot and treating it. Pervious pavement. This is Lake Hopatcong, down in your lower right. That's Lake Hopatcong in New Jersey. That's a nice biofiltration system we installed to take the runoff from the state parking lot, treat it before it goes into the lake. So there's all sorts of smaller BMPs that can be implemented. And I emphasize the smaller ones because I know lake communities, again, it's very difficult to implement the larger ones. We also talk about fluvial geomorphometry, and your management plan actually has a pretty good section on this. And essentially what this does is this takes engineering and ecology and sort of merges it, and it really focuses on stream banks. And remember I mentioned how many, you have I think it was like 300 miles of stream banks, 42 miles of shoreline. A lot of those exposed, eroded waterways are a major source of non-point source pollution. So fluvial geomorphometry is really a science that's taking both the ecology and the engineering, merging it to come up with solutions to prevent this from happening. So it's doing stuff like, for example, in this case, this was again at Lake Luxembourg. This is in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where we had some sections of shoreline that were not being used for boating or fishing. Well, they were being used for fishing, but I'll get to that in a minute. We said we would regrade and we were going to plant vegetation. Some of the fishermen who come up from Philly were outraged because they said, we fish there. If you install plants there, we're going to remove the plants because we want to get to our fishing spot. So what we did, and you can't see it now, so this was in 2000. The lower right is 2005. So it took like 5 years for it to get from that to that. We have these about 4 sections in the 2,000 linear feet where we have 20 feet sections of access so people can walk between the vegetation and fish. And now the fishermen are like, oh, the fishing is great now. It's better than it's ever been. Well, it's because we have all that cover, there's all that vegetation, there's all that structure that favors the little fish, which then favors the larger fish. So stuff like that not only benefits, bank stability, but depending on the width of that riparian buffer, you can add additional ecological value. Now, obviously, you can't do this everywhere, but wherever you can, if you can have vegetation, even on your own lot, if there's a section of shoreline that's not being used as a beach or as a dock, if you let the vegetation grow just as high as your knees, you'd be amazed how beneficial that is. There was one lake community up in the Poconos. I was walking with the environmental manager, and we were walking across a number of lots, and it was funny how some property owners let the vegetation grow as high as their knees, and literally right next to them was grass right up to the edge. And wherever you saw a plot where there was grass right up to the edge, you saw all the goose poop. As soon as you got to a lot, it was comical. As soon as you got to a lot where you had vegetation, no goose poop. If they can't see the water, they're not going to hang out there. They're lazy birds. They're going to stay over where there's grass. So literally just by having that vegetation in those areas where they're not having that direct access, they eliminated the problem associated with a goose poop. And geese can poop about 26 times a day. And I'd hate to be the student that figured that out, but that was in like a NALMS article. Like the outlier was one goose poops 72 times a day. I don't know what that goose ate, but something wasn't agreeing with it. But geese generate some of the largest amounts of phosphorus than any other bird. I think the only other bird that we're familiar with that generates more are cormorants. They have the higher amount of phosphorus in their poop. I know way too much about this than I should, but we'll leave it at that. So, when you look at this and you're looking at the benefits associated with riparian habitats, again, we're tying this into not just improving the water quality of a lake, but how this impacts our communities as well. So we go quite a bit in the class over floodplain management and how important it is to know where your floodplain is, your 100-year flood event, what areas are going to drain, what areas will be impacted. And this very frequently, over time, we've seen more and more of these extreme climate events, these extreme weather events, and we're seeing places that haven't been flooded getting flooded more and more frequently. So again, this is just showing another example. This was a case where a lake community wanted to mitigate the runoff coming from this stream. The lake upgrading of them was not sewered, it was on septic, and they had high phosphorus concentrations coming in. So we developed a floodplain management program where we installed 2 floodplain cells, so the water, when it comes in to this piece of property, it hits a certain height, then it's diverted into these floodplain cells. First thing we did is we had to get rid of the invasive species on site, which was reed canary grass. Then we got our appropriate permits, we did the regrading, and this is what it looks like now. And I love BMPs that don't look like BMPs. You wouldn't think that this is a workhorse, but this is removing a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus from this runoff, from these storm events before they end up going into their receiving lake. I also talk about climate change and the impacts of climate change. Just showing you the CO2 concentrations and how about 5 years ago it was predicted in 2017 how the CO2 concentrations would be a little over 400 parts per million. And lo and behold, if you look at the data coming from Hawaii, that's exactly what we're seeing. And every year I have the students, I pull up the data. So as of April of this year, it was coming in at like 414 parts per million. So we are seeing more CO2 in the atmosphere, and we have indeed seen an increase in temperature. The bottom line for our neck of the woods, mid-Atlantic, New England, is we're going to get warmer and wetter. We're one of the few places in the world that we're actually going to have more water, not less. Our temperatures could rise anywhere over the next century between 3 and 7 degrees Fahrenheit. More extreme heat days over the summer. Growing seasons could increase by 15 to 30 days. Within my span of 20 years of being a consultant limnologist, I remember, I sound like an old guy, but I remember back when I started in the 90s, I used to be able to go out to like Swartzwood Lake up in northern New Jersey. I'd have to move the snow and carve through the ice just to get a sample. Now we're lucky if we get ice. it's a rare thing. And even our HABs, we're seeing in our drinking water supplies, HABs persist well into November. Where I remember 20 years ago, once you hit September, those blue-green algae crashed. They were done for the year. Now we see them drag on into the fall. And so that's some of the impact we're seeing associated with climate change. And then sea level rise could rise anywhere between 1.5 feet to 5 feet, but then the number of frost days could decrease by 20 to 40 days. So if you're interested in drawdowns as a management tool for keeping weeds under control, that makes it more difficult to use that technique in our neck of the woods, because you need a frost before you get snow if you're going to have a good weed kill associated with drawdowns. So I'm going to wrap this up just talking about some extreme weather events. So this is one of the extremists, Hurricane Harvey. This was a couple years ago, August. It was one of the costliest hurricanes. At least $125 billion of damage, displaced more than 30,000 people, more than 100 deaths. There was quite a bit in terms of, we were obviously concerned when we saw all the coverage in terms of the volume of water, but this stormwater and flood water was very hazardous stuff, a lot of E. coli, a lot of viruses and bacteria associated with it. There were a number of Superfund and brownfield sites that were basically within these flooded areas. But what I really want you to keep in mind is, there was a lot of building going on before the hurricane, a lot of urban sprawl, and a lot of this was within the 100-year floodplain. And so since 2010, in this one county alone, 7,000 homes were placed within the 100-year floodplain. And again, these aren't homes that have been there for the last 50 or 100 years and they were grandfathered in or they were waived. These were new homes that were put within the floodplain, and this is what happened. And this is why stormwater management and watershed management is so important. And if you think, well, that was a hurricane, we don't get hurricanes in the Northeast. No, but if you're familiar with Ellicott City in Maryland, they had 2 heavy storm events that ended up doing this. I mean, as a company, we ended up over the last few years getting a lot of work in this part of Maryland because of stuff like this. We actually opened an office down here because of all the problems they're having with stormwater. So, and if you think, oh, well, that's, down in Maryland, well, this is just down the road. This was Conneaut Lake last year. So this was, again, not a big hurricane, but it was a heavy storm event the day after the 4th of July. This is one of our clients flew a drone over to show some of the damage associated with some of the stormwater. We actually used the video for this to mitigate and identify potential sites for stormwater management, for infiltration basins, floodplain management. So keep that in mind. So what's the whole point of my presentation? It's plant a tree. Plant a tree. Trees are workhorses. Think of one tree, 4,000 gallons just up into the atmosphere. Think of all the water going into the ground, all the water going into that biomass. So whenever you can, preserve and protect the vegetation you have, and plant a tree. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lubnow. Now, we're going to be collecting cards for anyone who has questions, and I just wanted to start out by saying that we do around Chautauqua Lake, as I'm sure you've noticed, have many lawns that go all the way down to the lake, and I'm not sure people, even though there are lots of resources on the website, and certainly the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy provides that service and information, could you talk about buffers and maybe give some idea about the difficulty or ease of actually developing buffers?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to buffers, you can make them as elaborate or as simple as possible. The simplest thing to do is let the vegetation grow to about as high as your knee right along the edge. I mean, that alone will, it will do 2 things. Number one, that vegetation helps to intercept any pollutants that are on the lawn before it goes into the lake. And number 2, it won't eliminate, but it will dissuade geese from hanging out on your property, generating all that waste. So that's the easy way. A more elaborate way is you may want to do some regrading or plant some native vegetation. I emphasize the word native Make sure it's native. You can make it as attractive as you want, but having some sort of vegetation, even if you want to have some sort of wetland plants right along the edge, that is really beneficial, not only for that, but it will also help to attract, if you're a fisherman, attract some of the macroinvertebrates and some of the small fish. So a lot of it is education. I always tell my students, you always have to say something to someone 7 times before it sinks in. You have to say it 7 times before it sinks in. You have to say it 7 times before it sinks in. And I do that joke, and I never get a laugh from them. Thank you. I appreciate the pity laugh. But yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. That's great. Very helpful. All right. So audience questions. You mentioned the Chautauqua Lake watershed has 3% wetlands. Is that a healthy percent, or do we need more?
I would say whatever wetlands you have, preserve and protect. Love your wetlands, number one. It would always be good to have more wetlands. Now, a lot of land just doesn't harbor wetlands. You have a lot of upland area that, again, you need those 3 things. You need specific type of soil, you need water, and you need those types of plants. Some of the upland areas just won't harbor wetlands. There may be some property in the communities, and I see this a lot with lake associations. A lot of times there's a piece of land that keeps being sold and resold and resold because it can't be built on. A lot of times it's because of wetlands. A lot of the lake communities we work with, they work to buy those lots. If there's something like that, that may be something that a community may be interested in buying and having it as sort of a green space. That may help to preserve or even expand wetlands. If it's zoned as residential but no one can build on it, that we've seen that as a successful way of expanding your wetlands. And that's different than like a wetland BMP.
That's great. Thank you. Goose poop is full of phosphorus. Is it better on land or in the lake?
The goose poop would be better not to have it at all. Geese are, they're supposed to be migratory. You want to minimize the amount of geese on your property, and how I've seen it most successful, and there's all kinds of ways of goose management, but where I've seen it be successful, and it doesn't happen overnight, it's usually 2 things. Number 1, having those buffers, and number 2, egg addling. Getting the permit to addle the eggs. Once after a season or 2, the geese realize they're not making babies, they'll go somewhere else. And if you make that property less attractive by having that low buffer, those 2 I've seen over time. Again, it takes a couple years, but over time the geese will leave that community. Now they may go somewhere else. You have a big enough lake, that may happen. A lot of the smaller lakes, they just go to another lake. But if you can do that collectively as a watershed, you want to make sure you're making Chautauqua as unattractive to geese as possible so that they go somewhere else.
Thank you. Do you think the Baptisia plant should be planted around the perimeter of the lake to prevent erosion, since it has very deep roots?
I'm sorry, what kind of plant?
Baptisia, Baptisia.
What, does anyone know the common name of? No, I'm a scum guy. I know algae, so I'm not. I'm sorry, say that?
Wild indigo.
Okay, is it a native?
Yeah.
Then I have no problem with it. As long as it's a native. We've used so many invasive species for one reason or another. The community I live in, we have a lot of Norway maples, and Norway maples we removed all these nice oaks. We put in Norway maples because they're fast growers, but they have shallow roots. So I've seen over time the trees have problems. Right now we're having problems with the lanternfly, eating it. Anytime you can use a native instead of an invasive, I'm all for it. Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Chesapeake Watershed uses technology to identify non-point flows by aerial scanning and observation. Has New York considered such technology?
I don't know if New York has. I know, speaking with the doctor earlier today, I cannot remember her name, she was talking on algae. Yes, she was talking about how they're going to be working with drones to do flyovers for algae. I can tell you that we, Princeton Hydro, we invested in a drone. So we use drones right after storm events. Like Coneyat, I actually got the idea from Coneyat when they sent that video to us. I said to our company, hey, we should get a drone. And so what we do now is after a storm event, we fly a drone over so we can get an idea of the patterns of flow. And we can look for sites where we may have room to install some type of maybe infiltration basin or some sort of stormwater measure. I have a feeling that type of technology, that aerial technology, is going to get used and implemented more and more frequently. So I would say if the state's not using it, they will be in the immediate future.
Great. All right, I have two buffer-related questions. Does long grass make a good buffer? And even for homeowners away from the lake edge, would buffers help in like regular away from the lake yards?
Yeah, grass is better than a parking lot, but not by much. Because the grasses, very frequently, grasses are being played on. There's, pets and kids, and that compacts that soil very frequently. The grassed area can almost function like impervious surface. Number one. Number two is if you're not using proper fertilizers, if you're using phosphorus fertilizers, 9 times out of 10, there's more than enough phosphorus in your soil. It's just most of the time the pH is too low for those grasses to use the existing phosphorus. So instead of using phosphorus fertilizers, lime it and then use a non-phosphorus fertilizer so that they can use that existing phosphorus. Because what they really need, what the grasses really are in demand of is potassium and nitrogen. They have more than enough phosphorus, so what happens is that phosphorus washes into the lakes, and that's where the algae and plants really need. They really need that boost of phosphorus. So to answer the first question, grasses, yeah, they're better than a paved concrete surface, but anytime you can enhance it with a buffer and do a little fertilizer management, it would go a long way. And yeah, anyone, whether you are at a lakefront setting or if you're away from the lake, by using those non-phosphorus fertilizers and having buffers, it will only help because that water does eventually go into the lake. I use non-phosphorus fertilizers. I don't even live in a lake community, but I use non-phosphorus fertilizers. One of the reasons is, 10 years ago, the bags for phosphorus fertilizers were very unattractive. They were just plain white bags. You'd look at the Scott's bag with the phosphorus, and it had kids playing on a lawn, and it looked nice and green, and so everyone would go to that bag. Well, two things happened. One is there was a lot of pressure to the fertilizer companies to say, hey, we want an alternative. We want a non-phosphorus alternative. And two, our phosphorus supplies are actually running out, believe it or not. So it was getting more costly for the companies to put phosphorus in. So they're like, hey, let's bag it. It'll be cheaper for us. We can call it, environmentally friendly, mark it up a little in price. And, and so they made this campaign where they rolled out these non-phosphorus products. But they do have a direct benefit, particularly for lake communities.
Okay, just two final questions one is, for a long time we were hearing about acid rain and its effect on lakes, and I'm wondering if you've noticed that at all, not only in Chautauqua Lake, but in the mid-Atlantic states and elsewhere, if that's a problem, and then also the problem with plastics, if you are noticing, impacts on wetlands and...
So with acid rain, a lot of the clean air mitigation that occurred in the 70s and 80s really helped to mitigate and stem the tide with acid rain. So a lot of that stuff was addressed. When I first started working as a consultant, I actually worked on a few lakes in West Virginia that were high elevation lakes that were impacted by acid rain. But it's something we really don't see as much anymore. And so when I first started, it was the early 90s, so it's when a lot of the clean air mitigation was just coming online. I haven't seen that as a major problem. And plastics, and Nancy alluded to this earlier, plastics, if you're talking plastics like trash, yes, wetlands can accumulate trash, but if you're talking about like the microplastics, you really have to be sampling for those. And it's a very elaborate and very detailed methodology. It's something we are concerned about. We use floating wetland islands as a mitigation route to help remove nutrients, and a lot of those depending on the manufacturer, some of those floating wetland islands are made of recycled plastic material. And so we're asking the manufacturer if they have any studies to show what happens with that plastic over time. Because the islands themselves are supposed to have a life of about 15 years. I have some floating wetland islands in that they've been in for 9 years. Is there a point at which we should remove them because of some degradation of plastic? I don't know, but it's something we're looking into that we're concerned about.
Great, thank you so much. Wonderful. Let's give a hand. Thank you.